Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In today's episode of Horns, we're talking with Dr. Erik Lin-Greenberg, the author of the article in Volume 3, Issue 2, Allies and Artificial Intelligence, Obstacles to Operations and Decision-Making. Dr. Greenberg is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse and an incoming assistant professor of political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology starting 2020. His research examines how military technology affects conflict dynamics and the regulation and use of force. In his book project, he studies how remote warfighting technology, like drones and cyber warfare, shape crisis escalation. Other ongoing projects, he explores how technology influences alliance relationships, the topic of our talk today, and public attitudes toward the use of force. He's also interested in the role of food in international politics. His work has appeared in Security Studies, Journal of Peace Research, International Peacekeeping, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, War on the Rocks, and Texas National Security Review. Dr. Lin-Greenberg completed his PhD in political science at Columbia University and an MS and BS in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Before entering academia, he was an active duty officer in the United States Air Force, and he continues to serve on the Joint Staff as a member of the Air Force Reserve. Dr. Lin-Greenberg, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Doyle.
Absolutely. So, perhaps to begin, if you could just give our listeners a quick thumbnail of the article for those who haven't yet gotten to it, give us the teaser of what it is and why we should go read it.
Absolutely. So the project itself sets out to explore how artificial intelligence affects alliance military operations, specifically the battlefield operations themselves, and then also the command and control and decision-making processes behind those operations. And what I try to set out to do in the article is to highlight different ways that artificial intelligence affects and creates obstacles towards battlefield cooperation. So things like data sharing and data standardization, looking at ways that adversaries might be able to use AI in nefarious ways to complicate both battlefield operations among allies and the decision-making processes that allies use to guide their battlefield decisions.
It's interesting because there's been a lot of writing, obviously, about AI and particularly about AI in military applications. But yours is the first piece I've seen that takes a look at how this affects the ability of partners and allies to work together. And I guess the first question that comes to mind is this different in any fundamental way from other issues of technology and capability that may separate allies and partners?
I think so. I think there's a few important differences that makes AI quite unique vis-a-vis other types of weapon systems. So as you alluded to in your question, there's a lot of challenges that allies and alliances, multinational security collaboratives face when they're integrating new technologies, right? New technologies are difficult to use. You need to find new tactics, techniques, and procedures and doctrines to use them. You need to find ways for alliances to use these in a streamlined manner, and then figure out how they fit organizationally. But what I think makes AI quite unique are really a few factors. The first is that there's pretty significant differences between the development of AI technologies and what we might consider to be more traditional, conventional military technologies, things like fighter jets and naval vessels. And this divergence in, I think, the developmental pipeline can really complicate the ability of states to develop interoperable systems, which are incredibly important for multinational operations. So a lot of AI technology that's used today is not necessarily developed by what we might consider to be the traditional military-industrial complex, at least here in the United States. So unlike engineers who work for firms like Northrop Grumman or Boeing or Lockheed, who have some expectation that they're signing up to work on defense-related projects, engineers that are working on AI-related initiatives in many cases are working for firms like Google, Amazon. They're software engineers who don't necessarily sign up to support the defense enterprise. And in fact, they might believe that conducting work that supports the use of force actually goes against their ethos of doing good. And we saw this play out recently, about a year ago, with Google engineers demanding that their company pull out of Project Maven, which was the Pentagon's program to develop AI and machine learning solutions to analyze full motion video from drones. So when you have these obstacles, you see allies developing very, very different types of capabilities. And you end up having some states that might be considered AI haves and others to be AI have-nots. So I think that's one thing that makes AI a bit different from other types of systems. And then a second issue that makes AI different from a lot of technology where I think we've seen debates among alliance partners is really the kind of ubiquitous nature of AI on the future battlefield. And that ubiquity will make very, very difficult for AI haves and have-nots to work alongside each other in contingency settings. So as we talked about earlier, allies have definitely had disagreements over certain types of military technologies in the past, and essentially whether to use these technologies, how to use them. So we can take, for instance, say, cluster munitions, right? One state might choose, because of some type of domestic political considerations, for instance, not to use cluster munitions during military operations, but could still participate in multilateral operations, but choose just not to deploy cluster munitions. But I think what's so different here is that AI is just becoming such a central element of combat and contingency operations. So really all elements of operations, from the early planning phases to frontline combat operations, have really started to incorporate AI. So if a state says that they can't object or can't use AI on the battlefield, we have to ask, well, how do they define battlefield AI? So can a state that has a no battlefield AI policy carry out an airstrike on a target that was identified by an ally's AI-based intelligence system? And I think those types of questions are things that we haven't necessarily seen before with other types of technologies.
Well, that actually raises an important question, and you deal with it in the article, but it's probably very useful early in our discussion to clarify, what exactly do you mean by AI? And in particular, what sorts of applications do you anticipate for it that will make it so ubiquitous on the battlefield?
Sure. So I think I adopt a definition that's becoming quite widely used by practitioners and theorists. And it's essentially AI is using machines and computers to take on tasks that would normally require human intelligence. And militaries turn to AI-enabled technologies in many cases because it helps them make operations more efficient and safer. So you could imagine using AI-enabled systems to analyze vast amounts of signals intelligence data or video from military drones that would normally require dozens, if not hundreds of people to analyze, and you can help streamline those processes. And then in other cases, AI is really baked into the operations of military systems. So things like autonomous aircraft, autonomous ships that can operate without a pilot on board, can fully command and control their own operations that reduce the risk to warfighters. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to note that AI is really an enabler. It's not a military capability in itself, but it's enabling different types of capabilities.
So when you raise the question of autonomy, this obviously puts into many people's mind this fear of the very catchy phrase, killer robots. But in fact, it seems like autonomy in military applications is not really yet in the world of killer robots. What are we seeing there?
So I think what we're seeing in cases of autonomous weapon systems, in many cases, are things like drone swarms, where you have systems that are using artificial intelligence to control large numbers of aircraft, large numbers of surface vessels to operate with each other, not necessarily to go strike an adversary target, but for tasks like suppression of enemy air defenses, for instance. And that is driven in part by norms against the use of killer robots, domestic policies against the use of autonomous systems in essentially kill chain actions. And so we're seeing a lot of these systems that are, again, not being used to kinetically use force against targets, but to support other types of military operations a bit more broadly.
And for our readers who are interested in these questions, I would commend to them the article by Tony Pfaff in Volume 3, Issue 1, about the ethics of acquiring disruptive military technologies, in which he considers AI, cyber, and human augmentation. It's a really interesting read that looks at it from an ethical perspective. So one of the things that struck me in what you said is it almost seems like there's a tension here. You said that AI is going to be ubiquitous on the battlefield, and you said that we're potentially going to have haves and have-nots. So do you anticipate that countries that adopt battlefield applications of AI are just going to fight in a completely different way than other countries? Is this going to be like horse cavalry versus tanks? I mean, what are we looking at there in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think there's going to be different rates of development and integration of these technologies. And we've seen this throughout military history where some states are better able to adopt military technology. So things like the aircraft carrier, right? Some states were able to do this much more effectively, whereas other states acquired systems but were not able to use aircraft carriers to project power or use them as effectively as other states. So I think what will dictate what states become AI haves and AI have-nots are a few things. So one is human resources and the human capital within a state. So do they have the engineering manpower to develop these types of systems? The other are financial resources. So are some states going to be able to invest far more money in the development of AI systems than others? And then most importantly, domestic political support for these systems. And this gets back to some of the questions from earlier about perceptions of killer robots. So in many cases, I think the public and pundits conflate killer robots with autonomy and AI. So you have resistance, which is understandable to systems that are quote unquote killer robots. And then you end up having a trickle over effect that leads to potentially opposition to other types of AI enabled systems. So in the case of the AI haves, we see states like the United States, which has stood up its Joint AI Center, or JAIC, which is a Pentagon organization designed to really synchronize the DoD's development and use of AI. But at the same time, we see other NATO allies who have been unable to invest in a robust AI infrastructure. So I think what we're going to see is that some states will start integrating this type of technology into military operations, and we'll look at these other states and say, hey, you've got to try to pick up the pace and contribute more and make sure you're meeting these alliance standards in terms of AI operations. And we also see that in terms of adversaries as well, who are developing AI capabilities. And I think that has triggered this notion of perhaps an AI arms race. And that's a debatable concept. But again, we have states like China and Russia that are investing very, very heavily on AI capabilities. And no state in the international system wants to be left behind and trying to catch up to the other state. I think that's why we're seeing so much AI development, especially among kind of large powers and large regional powers.
It's been said that the lifeblood of AI is data, that without data to observe, calculate, learn from, that AI is just an algorithm. And yet many allies and partners have very different approaches to privacy and the protection of data. How does this affect alliance interoperability?
Sure. So I think I'll try to tackle this in two parts. The first is just to talk a little bit more about the data requirements and the data standardization and sharing issues. And then we'll talk more about kind of the privacy concerns associated with that data. So as you mentioned, AI is just this incredibly data-intensive technology. It requires a massive amount of data, both to develop AI systems and then to enable their operations. And we've had problems within the U.S. military, for instance, in getting the right data to the right systems. So Jack Shanahan, Lieutenant General, who was the first director of the Joint AI Center, commented that essentially we can't even find, in many cases, the right data locations in our systems to pull that data out and get it into another system because the data is proprietary or it's on a system that no one can find. So you magnify that across an alliance and you end up, I think, being in a pretty tricky position because you have states that are now operating on different computer systems, are labeling their data in different ways, and then states really, in many cases, don't want to share the type of data that is often needed to fuel AI systems because it includes, in many cases, raw data that might reveal sensitive intelligence collection capabilities. And I think that's exactly what leads into some of these data privacy concerns. And so I can't claim to be an expert on data privacy issues, but I think that there's a few reasons why data privacy concerns have the ability to shape whether and how AI is used in these alliance or multinational operations. So first, I think you have a growing expectation surrounding data privacy, particularly in places like Europe. And then I think you couple that with concerns that militaries and intelligence services might misuse data. So first, there seems to be this emerging norm, or at least a set of expectations that data should be kept private, at least to a certain degree. And so we've seen, for instance, the implementation of things like the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, in Europe to protect personal data of Europeans. And then at the same time, we see growing fears that data could be potentially misused by governments, particularly militaries and intelligence services. And I think this really came to the forefront during the Snowden and WikiLeaks revelations, which showcased that the United States was reportedly collecting vast amounts of personal data and storing it for intelligence use. And much more recently, even in just the past few weeks, we've seen states like Israel and others use cell phone data combined with AI-enabled analytics to help with COVID-19 contact tracing. And it seems like several other states are going to follow suit. And so there's been this widespread criticism that this could lead to broad overreach of government authorities and the continued violation of data privacy. So when you combine all of this, I think in many cases you'll have strong public opposition, particularly in countries where you have this strong emerging norm about data privacy, against the sharing of data that could be used to fuel AI-enabled military systems. So I think that's going to be a huge, huge challenge for allied partners to overcome.
Well, that raises another interesting question because, I'll confess, when I read your article the first time, I had in my head NATO. This was what I was picturing as I was, thinking about the challenges that you lay out in the article. And yet, NATO is by no means the only important alliance for the United States. It's not the case that we have to have a different type of military to interoperate with South Korea or with Japan or with Australia than we have to interoperate with NATO partners. We've managed to figure out ways to make that work. But if what we're looking at are cultural, governmental, and societal concerns about data privacy fundamentally, might we find that there are some systems we can't use with certain allies?
I think that's definitely a possibility, right? We look at the different types of data sources that the intelligence community will pull from. And again, so certain states might be less reluctant to share certain types of data than other types of states. The other thing that I think comes up quite often is this notion of dirty data, and that is data that is somehow, biased because of how it's analyzed or by the algorithms that are written to analyze it. So there's been a lot of great research in the AI world that looks at, how different types of cultures cross streets, and then trying to make predictions for self-driving cars, for instance, where, how individuals are crossing the streets in certain contexts is very, very different than in other contexts. So you end up having AI algorithms that are trained in one context that might not be applicable in other operational contexts. And I think that leads to a host of operational challenges when you're thinking about a large power like the United States that could be forced to operate in multiple theaters of operations. So definitely.
Well, that's also fascinating because you think about, particularly as you move into lethal applications of AI, part of what you're doing is trying to anticipate how an adversary is likely to respond. And yet, if those cultural differences change on something as basic as crossing the street, that can lead to fairly significant misunderstandings and, at times, then perhaps an inappropriate application of force.
Absolutely. And that's even before you take into account the likelihood or the possibility of adversaries using AI in nefarious ways to try to manipulate blue force decision-making in operations.
One of the tropes that gets used frequently, and I very much appreciate that you don't use it in your article, is this sort of notion that AI will change everything. But I would like to ask whether AI is a unique technology in terms of its ability to actually affect the shape of these security alliances. Can you think of any other technologies that have the same type of potential?
This is a tricky question. I think it gets back to this notion of the potential ubiquity of AI really across multiple elements of military operations, right? This is purely an enabling capability. So all of these things that come along with AI, the ability of AI to perhaps make processes more efficient, to make processes faster, but then apply that across all types of warfighting functions, I think is pretty unique when we compare it to other types of technologies that alliances have used previously, right? You think about things like precision-guided munitions. Yeah, they have the ability to make certain types of operations more precise, but again, that's one specific type of operation that they can be used for. Whereas AI, as an enabling capability, I think has a much broader reach in changing the character and conduct of war than other types of technologies.
There's a saying in Thomas Schelling in Arms and Influence that I absolutely love, where he says that it's not the case that nuclear weapons gave mankind the ability to kill all other human beings for the first time. He says there's nothing you can do with nuclear weapons that you can't also do with an ice pick. But that what changed was that it enabled you to punish and to harm an enemy without first having to defeat them. Is there a similar sort of conceptual change that comes with AI, or is it simply that we do everything now turned up to 11?
I think it's a combination of a few things, right? So first you can turn up the knob on efficiency and speed, but again, there's big questions that need to be asked in terms of, are we comfortable with delegating certain types of decisions to machines that used to be made by humans? And I think that itself is a fundamental change in how we think about warfare. It's not saying that states are going to inherently delegate all responsibility to these machines. I think we've seen kind of Department of Defense instructions here in the United States and similar guidance elsewhere that require humans in the loop for certain types of operations. But at the end of the day, I think this type of technology really does have the ability to change how war is conducted by reducing the need not only to put humans on the battlefield, but also to change, how decisions are made about war, right? We've typically thought about decision-making being a very human-centric process within questions on the use of force, but AI potentially enables us to automate that to a certain degree. And again, humans will still be involved to some degree, but again, I think that this has a potential to fundamentally change how certain types of decisions and operations are carried out.
So that's fascinating because, our favorite dead Prussian, Karl von Clausewitz, defines war as an act of force to compel your adversary to do your will. Are you suggesting that the AIs may be distinct in what constitutes their will?
Hopefully not, right? I think you would still put in some type of objective for whatever AI technology to follow and to try to attain, but some of the decisions that are made along the way might be made without human input, right? So identifying, perhaps whether a target on the ground is a lawful target, that decision might in the future be delegated to a machine. And I think that's something very frightening for us to think about both the legal implications, the normative implications, and the operational ones.
The discussion of offensive lethal autonomy is one that rapidly goes down that road. And I think there are a lot of concerns, and rightfully so. But I think one of the other applications for AI and AI-enabled systems is in defensive lethal autonomy. And you also have a parallel strand of technological development that seems to be creating faster, more maneuverable, more capable weapons. You have hypersonics, you have Russian families of cruise missiles that aren't quite cruise missiles when you take a look at the Iskander and things like this. So if these developments are going on, is this increased speed of warfare really about AI? Or is AI simply a way to deal effectively and to defend effectively against technologies that are already speeding up the pace of things on the battlefield?
I think it's a combination of both the capability of AI-enabled systems and the systems that they might be countering. But I think AI in itself definitely has the ability to compress decision-making timelines and to speed up the rate of war, if you will, even if we aren't thinking about countering something like a hypersonic weapon. So the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, General David Goldfein, frequently uses this example in public to describe a recent command and control exercise in which AI features quite prominently. And I think it really showcases how AI can condense the amount of time that leaders have to make decisions in a more traditional operation, even one where you're not countering, again, a hypersonic weapon. So as part of this exercise, General Goldstein describes how a space ISR asset detects a simulated enemy ship. But the space asset isn't able to identify exactly the type of ship it is. So that space ISR asset automatically cues an airborne ISR asset to go fly over and collect additional information on the adversary vessel. It's able to identify it, automatically sends that information to a nearby command and control platform. That command and control platform figures out how to target the system and then finds the combatant that's most able and most effectively able to target the adversary ship and then passes that information automatically to the surface vessel that's nearby. And so this is arguably faster than a traditional kill chain process, which would typically involve humans at each step, kind of radioing or communicating information to that next level. But here, we don't see humans come in until that last step in the scenario, and the process is spelled out, at least in his public statements, as being kind of much faster than the traditional kill chain operations. So you can imagine that there might be a relatively narrow time window in which that simulated adversary ship might have to be struck, potentially forcing decision makers to act before they're unable to do so. And in that case, the simulated target is just an adversary destroyer or cruiser on the high seas. It's not a high-speed weapon like a hypersonic system. And I think at the same time, adversaries are also developing AI capabilities to speed up their command and control systems, as we talked about a little bit earlier. So the Chinese, for instance, have talked publicly about developing AI for their command and control systems. So if the goal of conflict is really to stay a few steps ahead of your adversary or to get inside their OODA loop, allied commanders who are facing an adversary that's using AI-enabled systems might have less time to think through the decisions that they're going to make across a range of settings, and that's going to speed up their decision-making cycle, again, even if they're not facing down a threat from a hypersonic missile or something like that.
That's curious, because when I think of this, and my background coming into it as a naval officer, I commanded an Aegis destroyer that had the capability to set up some degree of automation in the detection and engagement of targets. It's not really an AI system. It's a fairly simple pattern matching system. But what that system allowed was actually more time for the commander, because by speeding up some aspects of it, it gave the commander more time to make an assessment. And so I'm curious, because one view, as you've described, is that it compresses timelines, but doesn't it also have the possibility, by rapidly identifying queuing assets, providing the potential shooting platform with a targeting solution, doing these things, doesn't that give a commander more time to determine, using human judgment, if this is an appropriate course of action, or does the knowledge create a pressure to act on it all on its own?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think it's going to be quite situation dependent. So you can imagine certain instances where it could increase the decision-making space, perhaps of a commander, right, who has a task to, let's say, conduct a ballistic missile defense mission. His or her job is to sit out there and kind of look for these inbound targets. And the sooner that they can find a target, perhaps the more time they have to make a decision on how to respond. But then in other cases, perhaps where you're looking for a fleeting target, I'm not saying that it's a hypersonic weapon, but perhaps think about a counterterrorism situation where you're looking for individuals on the ground that might be driving in a car through towns where there's collateral damage concerns, information that you might not have had prior to the development of robust AI systems will be presented to you and perhaps force your hand into acting in certain ways. And I think we've seen similar debates about that type of thing with the development of the U.S. drone program. So I think it'll be very context dependent. And I think that's something that is definitely worthy of a future study to try to figure out specifically what types of environments will these new technologies essentially increase escalatory dynamics, and then in what types of environments it has essentially a stabilizing effect by providing a little bit more decision-making space for commanders.
That's fascinating. Yep. I want to shift gears a little bit and go back to something you brought up early in our conversation. You mentioned that AI technologies right now are not principally being developed by military companies. So that much of the work, for example, is occurring in the self-driving car industry or in other big data applications trying to optimize logistics applications. Does that afford an advantage to any countries that we would not normally think of as potentially major players when we start thinking about the alliance spectrum? It seems like for the last 60 years, our alliance network has been a 400-pound gorilla and all of our friends. Are the other gorillas able to get bigger because we're not relying solely on a defense infrastructure in order to develop this technology?
No, I think so. I think when we think about the types of firms that are developing some of this technology and how effective they are at actually getting this stuff integrated into military systems, I think we see pretty significant variation across states. I think in many cases you see small states like Estonia, Singapore, Israel doing an incredibly good job integrating some of this technology into the systems. And we ask ourselves why. I think there's a few underlying reasons, right? The first is many of these states have, at least in recent years, have had mandatory conscription. So you have these existing relationships between the folks that are now working in the private, defense sector that are able to reach out to their colleagues and quickly develop and meet the requirements of the defense sector. And the second is that they're essentially smaller countries and are able to field this much more rapidly than larger states that need to be able to ensure that everything lines up across a large defense bureaucracy. So I think it's giving smaller states a great deal of influence in developing these systems. And I think if we look at other kind of related realms, if we look at the cyber realm, a state like Estonia, for instance, is punching kind of way above its weight in the influence that it has in shaping cyber norms and shaping policy because it's been so effective at developing cyber capabilities relative to other states.
Which is also interesting because these are also some of the countries where when you take a look at the conventional security balance, there's a great concern that they may pose more of a risk to the alliance by virtue of their relatively exposed position than they do a benefit. And you're suggesting that perhaps they may be able to offer a strong benefit in these other areas.
Absolutely. I think if we think about alliances and burden sharing, these states potentially are able to become, if you will, AI experts and help larger states develop more robust AI capabilities and develop best practices that can then be shared with a broader community to help with AI standardization, data standardization, and things of that nature.
So I'm going to ask you to break out your crystal ball for a little bit because, one of the critiques of AI that comes up is some variation of the saying that strong AI is 10 years away and always will be. And we've certainly seen AI-like systems achieving a great deal of success in fairly deterministic environments where there's a set of rules that can be learned and understood with a finite number of behaviors within that rule set. That applies to games. It applies less well to driving, although there is still a set of rules that tend to govern most of the activity. It's the activity that falls outside those rules that creates the largest stumbling blocks. But if ever there was an activity that is ill-governed by rule sets, it's the notion of war. And so when do you think you're going to be seeing AI technologies that are really competitive in this space of a complete lack of determinism?
So again, this is an interesting and tricky question. I think it's going to be a gradual implementation of these systems. So you'll start seeing human supervised AI systems, I think, becoming much, much more prevalent. They're already on the battle space. But those will start being fielded. Commanders, decision makers, policymakers will start becoming more comfortable with the use of these systems, perhaps in certain types of areas that, as you mentioned earlier, don't involve the lethal use of force. So perhaps you use these systems for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions initially. And then you start to refine the characteristics, start to develop policy and make both policymakers and the public comfortable with these systems being used in military settings. So I think my crystal ball is perhaps a bit muddier than I'd like it to be, in that I don't think I can give a defined answer as to what specific types of capabilities or when these systems will come to the forefront. But I think in many cases, they're closer than we think. The Israelis, for instance, have developed AI armored vehicles that are capable of driving themselves. The Japanese are integrating AI into anti-submarine warfare vessels, aircraft. And so these are being used operationally. And in many cases, the barrier to full operation for some of these systems is a policy one, not necessarily a technical one at this point, although there are obviously a lot of technical obstacles to overcome.
Sure. And I speaking of policy obstacles, I had to smile a little bit when you brought up the idea of AI applications in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, because this is one of those mission areas that, everybody gets to feel good about. You've gone in, you've used this capacity to provide stuff that isn't available due to some natural disaster. But boy, from the privacy perspective, it becomes really sticky really quickly because now you're collecting information on civilian populations, and the information that you need is precisely the information that people are most worried about governments collecting in terms of where they're traveling, where they're congregating. The sorts of stuff you need in order to be able to deliver aid efficiently is also, unfortunately, exactly the sort of information that a government with ill intent would collect on its citizens.
No, absolutely. And I think another risk that potentially comes up in the disaster relief humanitarian assistance environment is the risk of unintended security competition, right? This is a world where we're seeing right now that many competitors are trying to get involved in this space. So China, for instance, with their involvement in their COVID-19 response, it's an area where states can actively use their military forces, use all the elements of state power to support what ostensibly is a relatively altruistic, type of scenario, but at the same time that showcases military and state capability that could unintentionally trigger unwanted competition, especially in the AI space, if we start thinking about the use of AI for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions.
Sure. And in the information in cyberspace, once you have access to that data, there's no requirement that can be enforced that it will be used only for this humanitarian assistance or disaster relief mission. So I'm curious because your article, as I mentioned, is unique as far as I know. I haven't seen anyone else approaching this aspect of artificial intelligence. And I'm curious, what inspired you to write this?
Yeah, so I think I started thinking about the relationship between AI and alliance politics last year when I was on a fellowship at Stanford. And the Center for International Security and Cooperation would bring in all kinds of great guest speakers, so scientific experts, senior diplomats, and senior military officers. And in many of these panels and roundtables that were hosted at CSAC, speakers would describe the role of AI essentially in revolutionizing how the U.S. would execute its foreign policy or implement its national security strategy. And much of this discussion really focused on specific ways that the U.S. military could apply AI-enabled technologies. But what really seemed absent from a lot of these conversations was, one, how the individual military services would integrate their AI-enabled capabilities with other services. And then I think more importantly in my mind, because of the coalition-based nature of modern military operations, how the joint force would integrate AI with their allies and partners. And so I started to look a bit at kind of publicly available government and think tank writing on AI development in this area. And most of it didn't go into too much depth on the implications of AI and alliance politics or multinational military operations. And so I thought it'd be kind of a fun project to try to unpack the issue a little bit more.
Yeah, I smiled again when you mentioned the idea of interoperability across the joint force as well as with alliance partners, because before we even get to the question of the policies of our alliance partners about data or their willingness to integrate AI into a potentially lethal decision, we have to get to the point where we can work comfortably with each other. And I take a look at, something as basic as the fact that still Navy and Air Force aircraft use a mechanically different refueling system for in-flight refueling. And you think if we can do that in something that is mechanical and relatively well understood, boy, the possibilities of how we're going to create challenges within our own organization as well as across multinational lines there seems to be a lot of potential for things not to go quite the way that we've anticipated they'll go.
Absolutely. And I think this is the hope that the Joint AI Center will try to standardize some of this. But I think there's been just so much excitement about AI that there's been both a top-down push for AI within the U.S. military across all the branches, and then also this bottom-up drive for AI development. So you have, young airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines operating at squadron or battalion level, developing AI solutions. And in many cases, these are being developed in stovepipe scenarios and not being shared with the broader force. So you end up creating, as you mentioned, even more kind of limitations to interoperability and sharing. And hopefully, kind of this top-down AI center approach will try to standardize some of this, and then we can try to leverage some of that goodness across alliance partners.
Well, Dr. Erik Lin-Greenberg, this has been a fascinating discussion. I hope that it has served as a spur for some of our readers who may not yet have had the opportunity to read your article to go back and do so. You can find the article in Volume 3, Issue 2, Spring 2020 of Texas National Security Review. It's available, as is all of our content, online at tnsr.org. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.